I'm going to talk today about The Linguistic Wars by Randy Allen Harris. But before I do, just a quick note about this video camera. As I mentioned on yesterday's video, my normal video camera, the battery has died. So I'm using my phone to record these videos, which has perhaps two disadvantages. One, I listened to the video yesterday, and I don't know, this could just be all in my head, but I don't think I'm entirely happy with it. I think it's got sort of a tinny or echoey sound. And then two, with this new camera, I can actually see my face as I talk, but there's a temptation to look at the screen then, and then my eyes are actually not looking at the camera, they're looking at the screen, which could be a bit distracting. First of all, if you see me looking the wrong way, apologies in advance for that. But more importantly, the sound quality, I don't know, let me know. I'm hoping that it may come off as a little bit echoey, but hopefully it doesn't ruin the video entirely. Because this is a really interesting book, and there's an interesting discussion to be had about this book. And it would be a pity if the whole video was unwatchable or unlistenable because of the sound quality. But you know, if worse comes to worse, I could always try and do a different video, film it again once I get a new camera. So let me know in the comments whether how distracting exactly is the sound quality of this camera. So that caveat aside, let's jump into it. The Linguistic Wars. This is an interesting book. It's partly a linguistic textbook that gets into the nuts and bolts of various linguistic theories, but it's also a narrative of a rather infamous dispute, infamous to linguists, that took place in the field of linguistics during the late 1960s and early 1970s. The author mentions in his introduction that he wants this to be a popular science book. So it's something that would be useful to linguists, but it's also a point of entry for people who are non-linguists. And the narrative framework of that helps to make it accessible. So it's on the one hand, it's a book about linguistic theories, but on the other hand, it's a narrative about different personalities, the history of a conflict, how this conflict blew up and became as acrimonious as it was. The author, there have been comparisons to the double helix. In fact, it's right on the back here, the double helix, which apparently, I've not read the double helix, but for those of you who are familiar with it, apparently that's also a popular science book which narrates a scientific controversy. So apparently this book is trying to do the same thing for linguistics, or at least that's the comparison that's being made. There are a number of things to talk about, but maybe let me talk about the general tone and readability first of all. So this book was published in 1993 by Randy Allen Harris. Randy Allen Harris, according to his bio on the back, has a number of degrees. He's an associate professor of English, but he also has degrees in communication, experimental linguistics, and English literature, and apparently has published widely in all three fields. Now, this is a monumental undertaking, and you definitely get the feeling that only somebody with that kind of unique background could have undertaken this. Somebody who has degrees in linguistics, but also has degrees in English more generally, meaning literature and writing. Because he has gone through and read all the literature of this period and seems to have understood it all. But not only that, he's created a narrative out of what's going on or what went on during that period, which involved interviewing, I think, hundreds of different people, or at least hundreds of hours of interviews with the key proponents of this controversy, as well as many of their students and just people in the field generally. And he's compiled all those anecdotes into one narrative in this book, well interweaving this with all the technical linguistic arguments that are going on. So it's very impressive. That being said, it's debatable how well he does at conveying some of these technical linguistic arguments to a popular audience, to a non-specialist audience, which is, as he says in his preface, that's the aim of the book. That's what he wants to do. In my opinion, I thought the first few chapters were very easy to follow. Relatively easy to follow. It required some level of concentration because it's written in somewhat of an academic tone, even though it's meant for a non-specialist audience. There's a lot of information being crammed into a small amount of space. But if you pay attention carefully, if you sit down in a quiet room and give this book your full attention, I was able to follow the first few chapters no problem. I began to lose some of this when we got into chapter 5, Generative Semantics, the model, when he's talking about the model of the generative semantics linguistic theory. And then on chapter 7, I believe it's chapter 7, he gets into a chapter called The Vicissitudes of War, which sounds like a very interesting chapter, but it's a lot of back and forth between the various arguments about the different linguistic theories. And I got pretty completely lost during those chapters. In fact, in chapter, on page 181, I'm not sure if this actually shows up on this camera. I've got a worry this is going to show up in mirror form, in reverse form. But I said, I've largely given up trying to understand several pages ago. Meaning I had largely given up trying to understand several pages ago. I just admitted it to myself on page 181. I just got lost in the technicalities of the back and forth between these two theories. The good news, though, is I was still able to follow the general thrust of the narrative for what that was worth. Meaning I was still able to follow the fact that so-and-so was publishing a paper which was a rebuttal of so-and-so, and then so-and-so published another rebuttal paper, even if I was not able to follow the technicalities of what was going on in those papers. And then if you stick with the book, chapter 8 becomes more readable again, because then it gets more into the culture and the politics behind this debate. And then chapter 9 and 10 are more based on the narrative. So in other words, this book is both a narrative of a personality conflict and it's some technical linguistic arguments. And you've got to be interested in both, or at least willing to take on both, if you're going to enjoy this book. I did my best with the linguistic arguments. I didn't understand everything. But on the whole, I found this book to be an absolutely fascinating read. I felt that even though I didn't understand everything, I still picked up some linguistic theory and the social and cultural history of linguistics during this period, and maybe some more general cultural history, because this deals with a period in the late 60s where Noam Chomsky was a significant cultural figure, I think. And so just his history or how he came to prominence and then how he became more controversial, it maybe would fall under the category of general cultural history. Okay, so with those general comments in the background, why don't I take a step back and just summarize a bit what it is that this book covers. Now, Randy Allen Harris, by his own admission, is vastly oversimplifying everything to make this digestible in one book. And to make this digestible into one YouTube video, I'm going to have to oversimplify his oversimplification. So there's layers of oversimplification going on here. But let me see if I can convey somewhat of a flavor of this book. So the book starts off all the way back at the dawn of linguistics and gives a very quick history of the history of linguistics generally. Randy Allen Harris says that it must have gone back to Neanderthal times. I mean, cavemen must have exchanged some thoughts on linguistics. But we don't have any of those thoughts. They're lost to history. So he picks up the narrative with the ancient Greeks, and he follows the ancient Greeks through to the medieval period, and then through to the Renaissance period. And I'm not going to get into the details of what he says about this period, but the common theme running through this period is that the science of linguistics is a struggle to view the human language through a scientific lens, to view it as any other natural object, just like the planets in space, or like a botanist would view a plant, and to try and observe it and make some sort of scientifically sound observations about what you can observe by language in action. The running joke through this section, though, is as the methodologies change, each generation of linguists thinks that the previous generation were being unscientific. So they're constantly saying, okay, everything that came before us was just unscientific ramblings, but now we are going to make linguistics a science. He has a joke at one point. He says, just as the middle class are always rising, linguistics is always becoming a science. So he follows that through in a very brief history, and then ends up in 20th century America. Now, in Europe, they were interested. They had become interested in historical linguistics. So, how the languages have changed over time from Old English to Middle English to Modern English, or the equivalent studies with French and German, and the search for the Indo-European language, which would have been the originator of all of that. But over in North America and the United States and Canada, the linguists have become interested in chronicling the Native American languages for a couple of reasons. One, they realized that there are all these languages that nobody had studied before, just right on their doorstep. But then secondly, they realized that these languages were quickly in danger of dying out, as the Native American languages were the speakers of them were dying out, or the culture was being absorbed by English. So there began what was called the Amero-Indian imperative, where it was the duty of the linguist to go out to take all the data that you could about these languages and then to archive them and to make a grammar out of them. And he talks about Harold Bloom and Edward Sapir during this period, but he talks mainly about Harold Bloom. Bloomfeld. And Harold Bloom is somebody different, isn't it? What was Bloomfeld's first name? Was it Leo Bloomfeld? Sorry about that. Bloomfeld. He talks about Bloomfeld during this period. I think Harold Bloom is the English professor. Anyways, it talks about Bloomfeld. Bloomfeld wanted to make linguistics into a science. And again, this is the running joke about how every generation is trying to make linguistics into a science. So he had this rigorous scientific process by which you would evaluate a language. First, you would evaluate the phonetics. Now, the phonetics simply mean the sounds of the language, the way the molecules are being disrupted by the airwaves, the sounds that you can map out on a spectrograph. But then these sounds will coalesce into different, what we call phonemes, which in English would be something like the B sound, like the B, or the M, or the vowel sounds, the A, or the U. And then those sounds would turn into morphemes, which is the smallest meaningful unit of speech. Often it's a word like cat or dog, but it could be a prefix like anti or un, or a suffix like nis or something like that. And then those morphemes go into words, and then the words would go into sentences, and then from the sentence you could get a grammar. And Bloomfeld did not want to spend time getting into the murky, unscientific parts of language, like talking about human consciousness, or how do humans form language, or how do humans make language, or what do the words actually mean, or what's the relationship between words and meaning. He wanted to push that all off onto other disciplines. So that's psychology, or that's sociology, or that's philosophy, but that's not true linguistics. And that was the way linguistics was in North America for a generation, until Noam Chomsky came along. Now, this book is called The Linguistic Wars, but it's almost about two wars, or maybe it's about one revolution, and then it's about the civil war within that revolution, because first comes the Chomskyan revolution. So Chomsky initially published Syntactic Structures, I believe was the name of his book, which was looking at how the elements of a sentence would move around as that sentence had different forms. For example, how an active would change into a passive sentence, or how a statement would form into a question, and how the sentence would move in very systematic ways. I got the impression, and I'm not an expert, but I got the impression that this was a really big break, or a really big development in the linguistic community. Apparently people had not been exploring this stuff before, is the impression I got from this book, because Bloomfeld had advocated to start at the bottom and then gradually build your way up. So phonetics, then to phonemes, then to morphemes, and talking about the structure of the sentence, that's years off in the future. So Chomsky jumped right into talking about this syntax, which is something that a lot of younger linguists were very eager to get into. But he also talked about the idea that as a sentence changes around, the elements of the sentence change from active to passive to negative to a question, etc. There is at the core of it some sort of core meaning. You've got the core sentence, and this is the kernel of the sentence, which is like the true nature of the sentence. And then from this true nature, all these changes originate. The name of this is changed over the periods the different periods of Chomskyan linguistics, but most popularly known as deep structure. So the deep structure potentially holds the key to the meaning of the sentence. However, let me back up a minute. This, as it's described in this book, initially took the Bloomfeldians off guard. They didn't quite realize what Chomsky was doing until Chomsky became too popular to stop. And then they were absolutely outraged at it. But Chomsky led an attack on the Bloomfeldians, he and his colleagues and his young disciples, in which he would attack the old Bloomfeldian model of linguistics in quite vicious terms, calling the people who adhered to the model stupid and saying that they didn't understand what they were doing and that it was an outdated model and they were cognitively deficient. And he did all this in typical Chomskyan fashion. So he was using very academic language, and one can imagine him talking in his typical soft-spoken voice. Although, much of this is before recordings in the late 1950s and early 1960s, or at least before it was common to record everything. At least everything that happened in a college university. Nowadays, it would all be on YouTube, but because this happened before everything was filmed, we're relying on a lot of oral memories for this period, which will be an important point later. I'll come back to that. Right. So because Chomsky, what was I saying? Oh yeah, Chomsky was using very academic language to do this, but he was still very viciously attacking the old guard Bloomfeldians. This book says that Chomsky and his followers developed what became known as the bad guys linguistic courses, where you would have linguistic courses devoted to just saying, okay, those stupid Bloomfeldians were doing it all wrong. They were holding linguistics back. Now linguistics is finally going to become a science, which of course is the reoccurring joke throughout this book, that linguistics is always becoming a science with each new generation. Lost my train of thought briefly. So one consequence of that, though, that Randy Allen Harris explores is he says that possibly this is one of the reasons that linguistics became so contentious over the next generation, is because Chomsky, even for all his good qualities, even though he's soft-spoken and he's incredibly gracious with his time, and he makes time for everyone who wants to talk to him, even students or graduate students, he'll make the time to talk to you and explain it to you. Even though Chomsky has all these very good qualities, he seems to thrive on confrontation, and he seemed to introduce this very confrontational element into linguistics. But the other thing about Chomsky is, despite the fact that he had this very big confrontation with the old Bloomfeldians, he did retain some Bloomfeldian holdovers, meaning in the end, he was very reluctant to dive too much into semantics. He didn't want to talk too much about what words actually meant or how words derive their meaning or the relationship between meaning and language. He talked about the deep structure of a sentence, but that's as far as he ultimately pushed it. Then Chomsky went on sabbatical to Berkeley in 1966. He had been previously based at MIT in Massachusetts. And while he was gone, there's a new generation of linguists. I say new generation. They're actually only about 10 or maybe 15 years younger than Chomsky. But for all intents and purposes, they're acting like the next generation coming up of graduate students and junior professors who want to really get into the meaning of language and derive a model which is based on Chomsky's model, but pushing it even further, called generative semantics. Chomsky's model had been generative grammar. This was generative semantics, which is, let's see if I can find some pictures of this. Sorry, I'm worried that this camera is just going to show the mirror image of this, but maybe you can get the idea of these Chomsky-like sentence trees that they're making up, but they're using the semantic meaning of the word to get different sentence trees going here. Here's another illustration. Chomsky comes back and goes on the attack against this new model, only it's a little bit weird. He doesn't actually name the model initially. He just launches a series of lectures called something like Thoughts on Nominalization, But in these lectures, he is attacking the theoretical underpinnings that the old model of Chomskyan grammar was based on, and the generative semantics model is based on. And the way it comes off in this book is that Chomsky's initial arguments are actually not very good and don't even entirely make coherent sense. It just seems like he wants to destroy this new model just for the sake of destroying it. But as the argument goes on, then Chomsky's model does eventually get some meat on its bones, and eventually Chomsky's new model that comes through in the 1970s ends up becoming more popular than the generative semantics model. And in fact, I didn't even realize this entirely, but Chomsky's universal grammar here, this book is actually not based, the theory of Chomsky's universal grammar as we know it nowadays is very different than what initially came out in the 1960s. It was apparently almost completely redesigned in the 1970s, partly as a reaction to the Linguistic Wars. But that's all the boring stuff, so to speak. What makes this controversy so interesting is for a couple of reasons. One, it got really nasty, really bitter. And again, this may have been a legacy of the confrontational aspect to debating about linguistics that Chomsky himself introduced in the late 50s and early 60s. The thing about this, though, is, again, this is before there was YouTube or before everything was documented on Twitter or on the internet. So a lot of this is just going off of the oral memories of people. So people have memories of screaming at linguistic conferences. Some people have memories of like 20 minutes of obscenities going back and forth between one of Chomsky's supporters and one of the generative semanticists at a linguistic conference. Some people even have like this memory of Chomsky and one of the generative semanticists fighting over a microphone. People have memories of one of the generative semanticists sitting in on Chomsky's class and just interrupting him all the time, telling him he's getting stuff wrong. And none of this is on video, obviously. This is just people's oral memories. And Randy Allen Harris compiles a lot of these memories, but then he shows that a lot of these memories are really too absurd to be taken seriously or contradictory. One person will remember one thing which contradicts something a different person remembers. So it's a bit of a Rashomon type mess trying to figure out what really happened. And he calls this the folklore of the period. And he says that probably a lot of this is not believable in a strict sense of did it really happen. But he says it does illustrate an underlying truth, which was that there was a genuine hostility and genuine volatile emotions running through this period, even if it's a little bit impossible to tell what actually happened during these linguistic conferences or during these supposed confrontations. So that's interesting. I mean, it's also a little bit frustrating that we're not able to really dig into this drama very much. What we do have is what was published in the linguistic journals. And that is mostly of a theoretical back and forth. And that's actually what most of the book is based on. The really interesting stuff, the oral anecdotes, are in here, but they don't make up the majority of the book. The other thing is that the media eventually found out about this. Apparently, there was a book which was popular at the time called Brother Animal. I forget the author, which was about a feud that Freud had with one of his disciples. I think the name was Tosk or Trosk. The name's not important. The important thing is there was a popular book about the feuding between Freud and his disciples at the time. So that this was in the popular consciousness. And then the media found out about this feud between Chomsky and his disciples, or between the next generation of linguistics. Sorry, it looks like I'm running out to the end of my time here. Okay, I'm just going to continue maybe in a new video file. Sorry about this. Okay, lost my train of thought. This feud between Freud and his disciples was in the public consciousness because of a book which had been published. So when the media got a hold of it, they framed the conflict along similar lines. And there was a 1972 article in the New York Times, something about Chomsky and his former disciples are quarreling or something like that, which you can actually read online. I looked this up on Google, and the New York Times archive turns out it's online. So I'll link to that article down below, because it's interesting reading, and it's an interesting insight into the controversy. Also, what makes this period interesting is, while this was going on, the whole thing about the Vietnam War and counterculture was going on. Now, Chomsky during this period was becoming as famous for his anti-war work as he was for his linguistic work, or maybe even more famous. So once the Vietnam War became in the news in 1966 or around then, Chomsky started devoting as much of his time to anti-war work as he was doing to linguistics, which perhaps is part of the reason why his initial arguments against generative semantics were so flimsy. I don't know, that's actually not stated explicitly in the book, but you can imagine. Possibly that's sorry. Lost my train of thought again. I'm filming this video on an empty stomach. It's always difficult knowing when to film a video. If I film it after I've eaten, then sometimes I tend to burp a lot while I'm filming the videos. But if I film it before I've eaten, I have this tendency to sometimes just lose my train of thought as I'm getting reminded that I'm hungry. That being said, we're going to soldier on here. Chomsky was becoming a celebrity during this time for his anti-war work, and he was working tirelessly against the Vietnam War. I mean, it was like he had two jobs. He was working full-time in linguistics, and he was working full-time against the Vietnam War. He was like working 80 hours a week. So as a consequence of this, he didn't actually have time to sit down and meet with a generative semanticist to talk about their disagreements and see if they can come to some sort of understanding. They tried to meet him at one point, but he got interrupted because he was getting interviewed by Time magazine about his anti-war work. It was just constantly busy organizing against the Vietnam War. What makes this ironic, though, is that on the other side of the aisle, the other linguists, the generative semanticists, were also passionately against the Vietnam War. Even as their rivalry with Chomsky grew more and more intense, and even as they grew to hate Chomsky more and more, and the rivalry did get very bitter, they were still on the same political side of him, opposing the war. And they wore their political affiliations on their sleeve, so to speak, to the point where in their academic writing, they would use example sentences that would illustrate how they felt about the Nixon administration and the Vietnam War. So George Lakoff, one of the generative semanticists, would write, in a very real sense, Nixon is a murderer. And this would be like an exemplar sentence which he would use to illustrate a grammatical point. So their exemplar sentences were all very political, which Chomsky didn't do. Randy Allen Harris in this book says that it seems that to a certain extent like they're trying to out Chomsky. But then he goes on to say, you can't out Chomsky Chomsky. He said Chomsky may not be writing example sentences like that, but Chomsky is putting more hours a week into opposing the Vietnam War than all these guys combined, as genuine as their political sentiments really were. Also, because this was the late 60s and because the generative semanticists were younger, they started embracing counterculture. They would write about obscenities in their example sentences, sex and drugs, and they would put a lot of jokes into their academic papers. Chomsky, of course, even though he's been quite radical in his politics, is always very conservative in his style, especially his academic style. So you had this clash of styles going on between Chomsky and the generative semanticists, which he goes into some detail on in the book, and which I found all that cultural stuff quite interesting, even though I couldn't follow the grammatical stuff very carefully. And then, in the end, Chomsky ended up winning out, even though for a while it looked like the generative semanticists were going to be the new dominant model, partly because Chomsky's initial flimsy arguments got beefed up a lot during the 1970s, and a new grammatical model that was appealing to a lot of linguists took shape. Partly because, as he details in this book, the generative semanticists got a little bit too deep into the murky nature of language and too deep into problematic data, and eventually ended up just spinning out into a bunch of different directions. So it's not, at least the picture in this book is not that their theory was flatly disproved, so much as the center, the gravitational center of the theory just began to disappear, and people went off in different directions. So there is a ton of things I haven't even talked about yet in this book. Chomsky's battle with Skinner, some of the... I haven't even talked about the personalities of the generative semanticists. There are 4 of them, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. They all have interesting stories and backstories. The linguistic theories I really haven't even touched on at all, partly because my understanding of them is loose. So if what I'm talking about in this book sounds at all vaguely interesting, it's worth checking out. You probably have to special order it, and it did cost me $50. And I looked that up on Amazon, and that does still seem to be the going rate. But if you're interested in this kind of stuff, check it out. I found it to be a very fascinating book, in spite of the fact that there were a few chapters where I really struggled to follow the linguistic theory. But I just stuck with the book and found the thing to be very interesting overall. Okay, I'm going to end this video here, and I'm not quite sure what's going to happen, if this is going to be 1 video or 2. There was some sort of message that popped up on the phone while I was using it saying, you've exceeded your file size with shutting another file, which might mean that this is split over 2 videos, but it never stopped recording. I'm going to experiment around and see what I can do with it. If this gets uploaded as 1 video or 2, I guess we'll find out.